Welcome to Untethering Shame, where we dive deep into the complex, often hidden roots of shame, how it shows up in our lives, and how we can break free from its grip. Today's episode tackles a topic that intertwines identity, expectation, and personal belief. We're talking shame and religion. Religion can be a source of community, guidance, and comfort, but it can also place heavy expectations on how we present ourselves, how we think, and even how we see our worth. For many, religion can lead to feelings of needing to perform or meet certain ideals to be seen as faithful or good, leaving us feel caught between our true selves and the person we think we need to be for acceptance or love. I'm thrilled to introduce today's guest, Carl King, a change consultant with a deeply personal connection to this topic. Carl has dedicated his career to helping people and organizations navigate change, and he brings a unique blend of empathy and insight into the conversation. Having once been on a path to ministry, Carl knows firsthand the pressure to conform to religious expectations, sometimes at the cost of one's own dreams and identity. He's faced the shame that can arise from trying to live up to these ideals, along with the fear that often surrounds from stepping away from them. Today, we'll explore Carl's journey, his insights into the performance-based aspects of religious identity, and how shame can subtly, or not so subtly, become woven into our spirituality. Whether it's the shame of not living up to others' ideals, the fear of embracing our true selves, or the struggle to find freedom within our faith, Carl has a wealth of perspective to share. So sit back, get comfortable, and join us as we unpack what it means to find balance in faith, authenticity, and self-acceptance in a world that often pressures us to be someone we're not. Carl, welcome to the podcast. I'm so excited to have you here today.
Wow. Thank you for having me. And my goodness, what an intro.
Well, I feel like I know, when I first started the podcast, all of my guests were people that I had known for years. I had known them in some different context or place and space. And so my introductions were a way to, I think, force people that I knew and loved to sit and listen to me say nice things about them because they often would get uncomfortable. And then I realized how good that felt. And even though we've spent, a collective of maybe 36 minutes with each other, there's so much warmth and depth and curiosity that you bring into this space. And so to me, I feel like introductions become a way that I can start to share with listeners what I'm experiencing of you and just how much I'm taking away. And then honoring, I think, a bit about who's on the other side of the microphone with me. And I don't think we are forced to listen to that enough of like people telling us kind things, reflecting back who we are, because we're so busy deflecting and moving and taking care of everybody else. So it's kind of nice when you have to just sit there and let me say things about you. And I get to do it. You can't talk because we're recording. So it's really lovely.
I'll take it. Thank you. No, seriously, thank you for the kind words. And I think, as you're reading, I guess I was really kind of reliving some of those moments that we talked about in conversation. And so, it's, as I don't know who said, but we've come a long way, baby.
Yeah.
That's pretty. Yeah.
Oh, I know. I love to start every episode just kind of thinking about then where we're at in the space today. Because I feel like you know this probably as well as I do, that depending on our mental, emotional, physical state, things look different. When you're talking to somebody about change, if they're in a state of frustration, overwhelm, distress, it's going to look very different than if they're at peace, if they're in a state of hope. And so if you could describe how you're feeling today with one word, how would you describe where you're at right now?
Driven.
Mm.
Yeah. I guess for context, I mean, you said one word. I'm about to give you a
That's
whole
okay.
litany.
You can expand. You're allowed to. Yes.
I just moved into what I hope is my forever home about 9 days ago. 10 days ago, I finalized a divorce in which I it was 18, 19 months of the proceedings in the process, and probably 3 years of the middle ground of
Mm-hmm.
knowing that, from knowing that it was coming to getting honest with myself about the process to negotiating that and trying to carry. I have 5 children, so trying to carry them and manage their expectations through the process, and just trying to make sure that everybody landed okay.
Yeah.
So now that all is kind of the dust is starting to settle. I've got to. I have a story to tell. I have a book
Mm-hmm.
that's almost written. I have people that I want to help and transform their lives now that I'm on the other side of it. I think, as you said, I've gone through quite a few different transitions in my life, and
Mm-hmm.
I have tried to do them with integrity and tried not to break anything in the process. I don't know. I feel like I've been somewhat successful, but yeah, I want to help other people because I see a lot of people that either they break or they break things around them,
Mm-hmm.
or they, I was reading a guy that was talking about healing and trees, and how trees can heal in broken ways. And
Mm-hmm.
so I want to help people with that. I'm sorry, I just talked a whole lot.
I reject your apology. I think that it had a lot to offer. And so we're not going to worry about that in that context. I mean, I think that's such an important part, and how cool that you can now sit in this space as we're recording today and experience that sense of kind of a recommitment
Hmm.
to how you want to show up and the impact that you want to have. And that's a thing that I think for many people, before they maybe make a big change, where then they're in that state of maybe kind of you described of like knowing or even considering, it's really hard to believe you can get to that place. And
Hmm.
also you spent the last few years in basically just how do I make it through mode?
Hmm.
How do I survive? How do I support? How do I keep together? And so there isn't much space in the mind and the body and the heart to be able to do a lot of expansion. It's not like that's the time you're going to take on all these big new projects, because you have to stay, like you said, with your integrity, taking care of yourself and the people that you care most about. In this case, your
Hmm.
kids, anybody else that was directly involved. And so to kind of watch that flip side. And I think there's likely a connection, because you started to allude to this isn't the first time you've had to make a really bold and hard choice
Hmm.
to break away from something that you either thought fit but
Yeah.
didn't, or
Hmm.
never fit but you tried to convince yourself of to begin with. And so you and I talked a little bit before we recorded about how you started having some of these experiences when you were young, and religion
Yeah.
being one way that that showed up. Can you
Hmm.
tell us a bit more about that and how that's kind of shaped your experience and your understanding of change overall?
Yeah, definitely. I grew up in and I think people use the word conservative as, I don't know. Yeah. Um, it's
It's
thrown
hard to
around.
know how someone might respond to that word, but
Yeah,
I think
yeah,
we'll go with it and then you'll give us some context.
yeah.
Yes.
I think I will. Yeah. So it was conservative in the sense that they were harking to and reaching for probably the 1700s, and so extreme conservative Christianity that on some people's lists it's listed as a cult. So it's apostolic Pentecostal. Not to throw apostolic Pentecostals a whole under the bus, but that's what I grew up as. And so I
Hmm.
grew up from literally from an infant, a baby, under the pews, people shouting around me. The women had to wear long dresses, no short skirts, no pants, no makeup, no they couldn't cut their hair, long hair only, and oftentimes it had to be up in a bun. and no television, no. In fact, the church I grew up in, they used to say, if you drink Sprite, you'll do right. So even caffeine was frowned upon, almost looked
Wow.
at as sinful. So that's what I grew up in, and I grew up in an environment where they had an idea of God as one, indivisible, despite the world around us and most of Christendom looking at God as multifaceted and as a triune, as three in
Mm-hmm.
one. And so from a kid, there was some dissonance for me and some kind of what is going on. I'd look around at the world, and I'm I think curious by nature, and so that helps, that curiosity. And also kind of, I'm not reckless, but I try to be courageous. And I
Mm-hmm.
think there's a massive difference between the two. And so, yeah, looking around and seeing the way that the world was working, and the people around me, my family members and friends, and yet I was in this, this very particular situation with the church and with the people in the church, and trying to make sense of it and trying to understand, okay, so there's some things that are wrong here. There's some things that
Mm-hmm.
just don't seem practical, and actually seem, the word, antithetical, or just against our nature, against natural laws.
Mm-hmm.
And so, yeah, and also like this emphasis on things that are really inconsequential, very, very insignificant things that become points of division and points of argument and points of, like, for instance, drinking Sprite. I mean, versus having some caffeine to keep you awake and alive. That doesn't seem like a big deal. But
Mm-hmm.
the church we grew up in, they would make a big deal out of things like that.
Mm. Well, and it sounds like, so you grew up, I mean, when we're born, we don't know what we don't know. And so
Hmm.
you're born into an environment where this is the norm. This is how
Hmm.
people around you function. This is your household and then your larger religious community. And it sounds like that's your primary community at the
Yeah.
time. And
Yeah.
so you're sort of being taught all these things, told all these things. My guess is you got good at falling in line because you had to. That's what you're supposed to do.
Yeah.
But there's this part of you that's like, I I don't know about this. I don't know. And I think, even when you described it, the word that kept coming up for me is rigidity.
Mm.
Whenever there is a rigidity and a lack of that curiosity, a lack
Hmm.
of that sort of, I don't know, I almost just think about malleability and that like
Sure.
willingness to shift and to change. I think there is something innate in us that's like, red flag. It
Yeah.
doesn't mean we do something with it, but I do think that by nature we recognize that and there's something that doesn't feel right. And so you were
Hmm.
in this environment where even as you're describing the people and the experience of being a part of a religious community as sort of the primary experience versus your faith and your opportunity to develop or explore faith in any way. This is how we have to function in the world. This is being a good religious servant of God, however it was described. Like, this is what
Hmm.
you do,
Hmm.
not a lot of this is like, I want to help you explore. And so, at least it sounds like I did not grow up in a very extreme religious environment, but even in a Christian and Catholic community, I remember feeling like I was told what I was allowed to do and how I was supposed to show up, but I was never given the opportunity to ask questions
Hmm.
or to explore. And so it
Yeah.
sounds like you had that just to a much higher degree.
Yeah.
And innately, you're like, wait, but I want to explore. And so, talk about the tension for me that started to exist there, because I can imagine that that doesn't feel good. And you're feeling this curiosity, you're feeling this, I don't know. But everyone around you that's your caretaker, your supporter, they're being like, well, but I know, and this is what you're supposed to do. So you should fall in line.
Yeah. Yeah. I think, yeah, you hit the nail on the head. When you want to ask questions and you want to get more than just, that's the way this has always been, or a rote answer. And as a kid, you're not asking questions to be sarcastic. You're not asking questions to try and get at people. You're
Right. There's
asking
no
questions because
malicious intent. Yes.
yeah, yeah, absolutely. So when you're I think when that is met with anger, and when that is met with hedging, and that is met with this is what the rule book says, and then you go and look in the rule book, and there's still there's some room for variation. There's some room for their wiggle room, right?
Yeah.
And because that's that's the other I guess that's the other part of my personality, is that I'm a researcher.
Yeah.
And so I love to go and dig and find information, find okay, well, are these the facts? What are the facts? And then
Yeah.
the problem with that is then going back to that authority figure and saying, well, since you referred me to this book, this is what the book says. Now what? And when you're met with that kind of that level of anger and just like there's no movement for me, that was like, okay, so that is really not about the thing. It's really not about the rule, is it? It's really about you as a person and
Yeah.
what you want and your control over others. And
Yeah.
if there's one thing I think that will get most people's hackles up, and that's Southern, right?
Yeah.
If there's one thing that'll make people mad is when they feel that they're being lied to and controlled. And so,
Yeah.
yeah, at that point, you have a decision to make. Do I fall in line? Do I allow someone to control me, or do I make a move elsewhere?
Yeah. And in your case, you're not an adult when you're
Mm-mm.
feeling this, you're a kid. And
Mm-hmm.
so the question isn't even as simple as that, which is already a really complex and painful question to be in, of
Mm-hmm.
like,
Mm-hmm.
do I go my own way and lose community? Do I try to figure this out, or do I fall in line? It's also, do I lose love,
Mm-hmm.
acceptance, belonging,
Mm-hmm.
nurturance? I mean, we could just list all the things. Or do I shut my mouth because I need those because I'm a kid? And
Yeah.
I think that the really tricky part when we think about whether it's religion or anything else is when love and acceptance is based on condition.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what we come to know, and we don't experience unconditional love. We assume all love and acceptance is based on condition. So it
Yeah.
primes us to have the assumption that we're always going to have to perform. We're always going to have to fall in line. And in the beginning, it really is about everybody else. But over time, shame comes in and it's like, well, shit, I'm going to come up with a rule book too, because look, there's too many risks. We need to learn how to do this and to do this really well. And so, yeah, I think a lot about the one thing I tell my daughter that I'm very certain of is that I know nothing other than I love her, and I'm
Yeah.
gonna fuck up all the time. Now, I never use that word
Absolutely.
because she's 4 and a
Yeah.
half, but
Yeah.
I know nothing. Like, she is exploring religion. We have a lot of people that come from a variety of religious backgrounds. I'm so excited for her. My biggest thing is like, explore as many as you can. We
Mhm.
don't know. And my biggest, and again, she's 4 and a half, but we've had a lot of conversations to the obvious point. We're recording this in November 2024. There's been a lot of discussions, regardless of what people believe, how they wanted the election to turn out. A lot of conversations around power and around
Sure.
fear and around leadership and what that means. And the biggest thing that we talk to her about is when you get to a place where you believe that your answer or your way is the only right way, I think you've screwed yourself and the world around you.
Yeah.
And my guess is, if we look back and we think about the people you were around, your parents, your caregivers, the church, I don't think that their intent was malicious either. But I
Mhm.
think when you come from a place of defense, and when maybe you yourself haven't learned how to ask questions, it feels like a threat. And the only way to deal with a threat is to shut it down.
Yeah.
Instead of what I try to invite with my daughter now is like, if I tell her to do something and she says why, how do I celebrate that? Because if I
Mm.
don't have a good answer, then there's probably no right that I have to be telling her to do something.
Yeah, but most parents aren't cool with that.
No, because they've been taught the same thing that we were taught, which is
Yeah.
here's the expectation, here's the condition,
Yeah.
all in line.
And how dare you question my authority?
Yeah. I mean,
Yeah.
so thinking about this again, going back to you as a young kid,
hmm
you knew, you had this inkling, gosh, I don't think this is for me.
hmm
And yet your sense of power, control, independence wasn't there because you were young. And so what did you do and how did you reconcile that?
Okay. Well, I think there were two pretty significant events. One was when I was going into fourth grade. So my mom was one of the only women in the whole church that had a bachelor's degree. And she had a degree in social work. And um, I guess to give a little bit more clarity, we were the only Black family, Fort Worth, Texas. And so there's that context too.
Mm-hmm.
So as a young person, I remember getting called darky and all kinds of other slurs and having to defend myself from that and going to our parents and saying like what are they calling us, what are these names, because we had no context. We went to the church school that they let my mom work at and gave us tuition as a result of her being a teacher there. And so my mother, for her, is she wanted to secure her children with an education, and she felt a private school
Mm.
education was the best thing. And so there were these kind of compromises that she made. And so one of them was having us in a very, very racist, just for shorthand, a very
Mm-hmm.
racist environment where they were doing Stephen F. Austin plays and singing about darkies, and we were the brunt of the jokes. And yeah, and so that was some dissonance, right? So that was like, okay, something isn't right. And fourth grade ends, and we're preparing for the next year, and the pastor's son graduated, and they shut down the school because they didn't need it anymore because he had gotten his degree.
Right.
And so that threw my family and all, like the whole church, into kind of a tailspin because we were trying to figure out what was this. I thought this was an education. So that was one thing. And
Wow.
then the next thing was when I was about 11 years old, I found a love for singing. I found like this absolute passion. I was good at it, and I started trying to explore this creativity. And they didn't have a kids choir, they didn't have a youth choir, but they had an adult choir. And when I was younger, I had memorized all these scriptures, and they put me in front of the church and let me put this performance on. I'd memorized all of Matthew chapter 7, which is like 38 verses, and it was 5 years old. And everybody was, oh my gosh, what this prodigy or whatever. So I thought that was okay, and I thought they would make exceptions for me because I was gifted in something. And so I was gifted in singing, and I tried to join the adult choir, and they said no. They said no, you
Mm.
cannot. You have to wait until you're 18 years old. And it crushed me because I was like, I can sing better than all of the adults right
Mm-hmm.
now at 11. And yeah, that probably sounds really arrogant, but it was true. And
Mm-hmm.
I wanted to sing for God, and I wanted to exercise this gift. And there was another moment when I experienced this rule book that was thrown at me arbitrarily, and
Yeah.
it was really weird. And so I think there were multiple times where it was just clear something isn't right here. This is
Yeah.
not built on a simple set of rules that are normal and we can all understand them. This is something that is capricious. This is somebody's power trip.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, I think about going back to your Sprite example of
hmm
like, wait, so help me understand that racial slurs are okay as long as they're not drinking a Coke. Like, just this, like, what the fuck? Like, that's not. And but what you see, I think that you just pointed out that's so key, and this happens, it's not just religion, and I feel like it happens in so many different places and communities where power, authority, money, like we see it. We are bred to seek it. We believe we have to climb over each other to get power. It's
Yeah,
very, at least in our culture, I think more collectivistic cultures, it's not as prominent, but I think innately it's there, that sort of competitive sense.
sure.
So you see it and you're like, well, wait, I mean, looking at it now, we can go, well, yeah, there's a certain degree of continuing with systems of oppression to make
Hmm.
sure that somebody that, hasn't been deemed to have the right color skin doesn't take up too much space and power and they
Hmm.
stay in their place. We'll let them in the church,
Hmm.
but they better, know where their place is. So you
Yeah.
see these subtle things. And then you see you're not allowed to sing. You're not allowed to sing for God. You are claiming your connection to your faith and wanting to represent that and do good for the community. But nah, we're good with you just sitting there and not getting to do it. And you see, my guess is if we were to sit down with the people that decided you couldn't do it and say, please help me understand why,
Hmm.
we would have only been met with some iteration of because I said so.
Yeah.
And that idea for you, it sounds like, was like, wait a minute, I'm starting to see that this is a human problem,
Yeah.
that there's got to be something else going on here. Of course,
Hmm.
obviously, also with the schools shutting down when the
Hmm.
person in a position of power and their family stopped benefiting. And
Yeah.
so you start to see this, but you're also old enough now that you've conditioned some patterns that you should conform,
Hmm.
you should shut your mouth. And again, the religious norms weren't the only system that you were seeing that was a power system putting you sort of in a one down position. And so, gosh, how did you reconcile all of this as you like move towards adulthood? I know you continued a bit for a while down that more like performative faith path that we talked about or we kind of alluded to. What was that like for you? And was it hurtful? Did it cause you pain? Did you know what you were doing was performing, or had you kind of deconditioned yourself from asking the questions and being curious at that point?
Yeah. No, I never stopped asking questions. I think sometimes I think sometimes and I do this now even, there are some questions that I don't have an answer to that I'll put on the shelf and I'll ask
Mm,
myself, is this something that I have to know? Is this a game? Like, is this a
yeah,
deal
yeah,
breaker? Does
right.
that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely.
Is it life or death, or or can I survive for right now without having clarity and a definitive answer on this thing?
Mm,
I was listening as you were talking, and you talked about, and I was actually thinking about when I said, I'm a researcher, and I think that research is
mm.
probably trying to know what are the rules, right? It's probably a reaction
Yes.
to, okay, so if I'm in this rule based system, if I know the rules, then I won't run into any obstacles. I won't hurt anybody. I won't hurt myself. I won't.
Hmm.
So, yeah, I think that is a some type of a response to my environment, and I can own that. It's
Hmm.
okay. But yeah, so after the age of 12, so what ended up happening, what's wild in all of these top down authoritarian structures, they tend to fall apart. Some last longer, some last shorter. In this particular church, and you'll see these churches, they're rife, oftentimes
Hmm.
rife with sexual promiscuity,
Hmm.
and you can define that however you want to, and I'll leave the listeners to judge it however they will, right?
Hmm.
But and then honestly, in some of those specific instances, there's child abuse, there's a bunch of other things that are actually bad and wrong and evil. But, there's also people using their power, and there are other people that it's almost like a balloon. They're suppressing so many parts of themselves that it pops up or bubbles up in other places that they're trying to, because you just can't suppress your whole self forever.
Right.
It's just
Right.
impossible. So the church ended up falling apart. The pastor fled. The people all went to a bunch of different churches. Some got free and got out. My family went to a church across town that was not as restrictive, but almost.
Mm-hmm.
Also, probably 98% white. There was something I don't know. I'm still unpacking what that was and what that is.
Mm-hmm.
My father passed in August of this year, and I've been trying to do quite a bit of work of introspection and honoring him, and also trying to understand the needs that he had, the motivations that prompted the decisions that he made.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of conversations that now that I'm older that I'd like to have with him. And now that I'm out of these religious contexts in the way that I was raised. So
Mm-hmm.
anyhow, we went to another church, and I honestly, I doubled down. Your question was, what did I do?
Mm-hmm.
I doubled down. And when I was 14, I accepted a call to preach, and I started in this young ministers training group and started preaching on street corners. I'd go to nursing homes every week on Thursdays and wheel all the people from their rooms into a general common area. I'd sing and preach, and my parents would be there with me and supporting me. And yeah, I went whole hog.
It's interesting because, well, two things came up for me. One is you were responding to this sort of reflection on being a researcher. Gosh, I think there's a truth to that. This idea of where a researcher is trying to find the answer, whatever
Mm-hmm.
the answer is. And so I think when we think about that in the context of shame, it's I need to know all the rules so I know how to play so that
Yeah.
I can be okay. And you might still have those questions, those curiosities, but there's also a safety in that. And it's interesting because when you first talked about your experience through this divorce and multiple big changes, you've talked about
Mm-hmm.
your goal of not breaking anything.
Mm-hmm.
And your goal of keeping it all together, which is just, I think there's a thread to that of like knowing the rules and the system and how to make sure that you don't cause harm
Yeah.
in some way, shape, or form. So my guess is there's something there. I'll just pin that. Just, do with that what you will. But I think
you didn't tell me I get a free session.
I said, well, just, you let me know what it is. I have these moments all the time where someone says something to me and I'm like, damn it, I got to take that one into therapy now. I was not ready for that. You're supposed to say something else. But the idea too about dad and this notion of like, wondering about dads. And I think you use the word motivations or like his needs with that. And I also wonder if we think about sort of intergenerational transmission of trauma, of rules, of norms, if there's some perpetuation, when you see somebody that has been deconditioned to have any sense of power and authority,
Mm-hmm.
whose job then as a parent, as a man,
Mm-hmm.
even if we talk about, and we could break down, I mean, this would be 6 more episodes to break down like being a Black man in our culture in the South, like what that looks like.
Mm-hmm.
But some of the pressures that were then given to him, along with the stories about you have no worth and value, and yet here's what it means to be a man and to protect and to do this.
Yeah.
There's this part of me that wonders if these very restrictive, rigid, conservative, whatever word we want to use,
Mm-hmm.
systems felt in a very shame-based way
Mm-hmm.
comforting.
Yeah.
Because they were a suppression of him as a full self, because he couldn't dare to believe that he could be something more and wanted to protect you in some way
Yeah.
of maybe putting the ceiling so low that you didn't expect more to then have pain.
Yeah.
Because he had been conditioned to believe he had no power and control either.
Yeah. I would be with you 100%. Absolutely.
Well, and so, I think about you and this idea of So you fall into, you said you became a minister, you started in this realm.
Mm-hmm.
I'm curious, and I want you to tell us then what happened, because you obviously left and you've done a lot of unpacking of this and some of that breaking free, that lack of sort of performative space.
Yeah.
I also think I'm curious if you can connect that then to, because when you mentioned a lot of these systems, and I'm thinking, we're talking religious communities, you also talk about that top down. And I'm thinking,
Mm-hmm.
well, yeah, then no, duh, you work with corporate companies
Mm-hmm.
because
Mm-hmm.
the systems and the structures aren't that different. It's just maybe more covert than overt
Sure.
in terms of power and control.
Mm-hmm.
And then a fear of maybe making changes within those systems because that's how it's always been done. So it's a very interesting
Yeah.
connection to me now to see that that's what you do. So first I want to hear, okay, so you're pursuing this path. How did you
Uh,
make the decision? I don't want to do this. This isn't for me. I have a right to choose something different.
mm-hmm.
And then connect it for me as to how you then got into helping people through change and really
Mm.
working with systems that represent a lot of what you had to break free from yourself.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, well, I'll try and truncate. I'll try and shorten for all of our sakes about 20 years of work. Yeah, 14 went whole hog
Yep.
and tried to be a preacher minister when I was um, there's a lot, but I'll say that pursued that path. Will shorten it. I pursued it and tried really hard to do it for many years, and then around 23, the pastor that had been kind of my spiritual leader at the time, he had the goal of having a lot of preachers under him that had a lot of different churches. And he was going to be their spiritual father. And so he encouraged strongly a lot of young men that had been in his program to start churches. And I started a church out of my house. It was difficult, but I didn't want it. And long story short, I self sabotaged in so many
Mm,
different ways. I self sabotaged and ended up having to leave the church. Basically, I got it shut down. I've done a lot of kind of introspection, and I don't say this disparagingly of my ex, but I will say it honestly about myself that I was in a marriage that I knew what the marriage was. I knew it was an arranged marriage. The pastor and his dad had done some matchmaking, and our families were, she was dark skinned, I was dark skinned. And so
mm-hmm.
it was obviously meant to be. And, and so we were pretty much the two eligible people of our age and our skin color at the time. And so they put us together, and I knew what it was.
Yeah.
I'd grown up in that environment, so I knew what it was. She grew up in a different culture. She grew up first in Sri Lanka and then in Germany. And so that emphasis on race and kind of, those restrictions weren't front of mind for her. And
Mm.
so I was self-sabotaging around 23, 24. I was I started watching porn, just like a
Mm-hmm.
lot. And she found me watching porn one time, and it was a really big deal. It was really heartbreaking for her. We went to the pastor, and he put this spyware on my computer with my agreement.
Mm.
And his words to me were basically, "You're going to make me look bad. You can't watch porn. I've struggled with it all my life," he was saying, those kind of things. But I knew deep down what he was saying. Basically, you got to stop doing this. And he told me.
Mm-hmm.
And so I went and watched porn again, and I knew it was going to show up on the records. And
Mm-hmm.
so he calls me in the office, "What are you doing? You're supposed to be a pastor, whatever, whatever." And I didn't want to be a pastor of this church. And he told me, "If you do this again, I'm going to have to sit you down, and you're not going to be able to be a pastor again." And I know having years worth of looking back on it, but I sabotaged the whole thing. And
Yeah.
so I went and watched porn again, and, and it showed up, and it was kind of like, are you going to, you made this promise.
Yeah, I'm
Is it?
waiting. I'm waiting. Where
Yeah.
are you? Yeah.
And so he did. He shut the whole thing down. I was probably 7 minutes from the main church. And so we had like two families, my mom and dad, and then another family had come from his church to help me kind of build this church. And we just sent everybody to the other church, which was 7 minutes away, and got out of the lease and ended that. And so that was a way for me to get free of the pastor label. Unfortunately, I didn't get completely free. And so years later, I went and traveled for about a year and a half in a truck and trailer, preaching around the country, and then ended up pastoring again. And this time, fortunately, it was in Chicago, or a suburb of Chicago, and I was away. I had distance, physical distance, and emotional distance from this overbearing kind of personality, this authoritarian personality.
Yeah.
And I was able then to slowly come to myself and think clearly about, okay, what do I really want? What is going on in the world? How am I showing up? And through that process of excavation, I realized I'm doing something that is killing me. I am broke. My family's broke. I lost my truck. I lost my house. I poured all of my money into this church, and then we got evicted from the house because we weren't making any money. We were living in the basement of the church. And it was at that point, I had a falling out with the pastor. He had called me, and I know I'm talking a lot, but he called me and he said, I had this dream. This is me. Like I'm facing eviction, and he's living in a 5-bedroom mini mansion with,
Yeah, of course.
2 luxury cars. And he calls me. He's like, Carl, I had this dream, and the Lord told me that, you need to humble yourself. And I listened, and I was so broken at the time. I was hurting so much. And I I don't know. I don't know what got a hold of me except for just common sense and just clarity. And I said, I got quiet, and then I said, I don't think that dream was for me. I said, listen, I am the most broken I've ever been. I have no money. I'm about to get evicted from my house. My kids need clothes. I don't have anything. I am broken. And I was. There was no hyperbole.
Yeah.
And I said, the dream may have been for you, but it wasn't for me. And that part, when I said that, woo, he hit the roof. He just started like yelling and screaming on the phone. How dare you? And yada. And so I'm just sitting here on the phone, and I hung up. I realized that I was in an abusive relationship, and I just hung up. And that was the day I got free, because I decided I don't need this. It's such a drain on my life, and I've given everything I can give to it. I've not held back. I've not been fake. I've not been phony. I've given everything, and all it has is demanding more. But through that process of physical distance and space, I was able to start to find my own self and my own way, and a community that was not extreme. I think the challenge for most people is not getting away from the religion they grew up with, or getting away from a controlling form of religion. It's going to the other extreme. Because I've seen a lot of people that start to find their identity as ex evangelicals, or ex this, right? Or they go directly into atheism, and it's not an atheism born of a desire or an understanding, but it's an atheism born of reaction to the other thing.
Yes.
Right. And I'm sure you've seen that in other, in other instances, right? You go from people that go from a relationship where they're in an abusive relationship to somebody that doesn't even pay attention to them, right? Because they feel that that's freedom, and neither are freedom or truth or good relationship. Anyhow,
Yeah.
I've talked a lot.
No, I mean, a couple of things came up for me. One, when you talked about sort of your almost being stuck inside of ministry and being in this role, there's this part of me that's like, again, when we're born, we are looking for ways to secure connection and belonging.
Mm-hmm.
And whether it is this head pastor or your dad or someone else, they're telling you, here's the roadmap to get my approval. And so
Yeah.
how could you have expected you would pursue anything else when the answer was in front of you of how you could secure love and connection? So of course you're going to go there and you're going to do this and it doesn't feel right, but you're doing it anyways because gosh, at least they'll love me. At least they'll
Yeah.
think I'm doing something good. At least my dad might be proud of me
Mm-hmm.
that
Mm-hmm.
I'm doing these things. And so there's
Yes.
this feedback loop that gets created. So we stay stuck in that. And then going back to what you said earlier, I can't remember exactly why we were talking about it, but you said you can't suppress your whole self
Mm-hmm.
or you can't suppress yourself forever. That's what happened to you. I mean, you were suppressing yourself and there was an external reinforcement of that suppression when you were in that environment. The moment that that was taken away, you were holding a beach ball under the surface of these giant massive waves for years. Of course it's going to start to come up and you're like, oh shit, what's that? Oh, wait. And you start to kind of notice it again.
Yeah.
And then
Yeah.
like you said, this very specific day became the day that you decided I have power, but you had been conditioned to believe that you had none. And so
Yeah.
it's a choice. It's a decision that you made, not with this knowing of your worth and value and bravery, but a choice to do the brave thing, the courageous thing, the emboldened thing to say, oh, maybe not this anymore. And so there's so much, I think, that whether it's religion, it's a corporate structure. I mean, gosh, in the last few years, especially with COVID, and I am based in Portland, Oregon. So the number of large companies we have around here that have gone through massive layoffs, and I'm like working
Yeah.
with people all the time who are
Mm-hmm.
constantly afraid of being laid off, constantly afraid that they're going to find an excuse for them not to be around. And we talk about toxicity in work environments that make you feel like you aren't good enough unless ...
Yeah.
You saw that and you saw it there. Two things that you just pointed out to that I think are important that I know we have to wrap up. And so maybe this is just saying we're going to have to do a second one at some point because we have too many other things to talk about. Is
Sure.
one, what you just said about those extremes. I see it honestly a lot with people that come to me that are people pleasers. They are, maybe very passive in their relationships. They've taken this position of, I am going to conform and be whatever I can be to take care of you.
Yeah.
And then they go to the extreme on the other side and they go, nobody's ever going to take advantage of me again.
Mm-hmm.
I'm never going to take care of you. And that's that extreme other side. And I think like
Yeah.
what you're describing with religion is that reactivity that still takes away your position of power.
Mm-hmm.
Because the question was never whether or not God exists
Mm-hmm.
or multiple gods or
Mm-hmm.
how God shows up, if there's
Mm-hmm.
one part or three parts. That was never the question on the table. It's, do I want to be a part of a community that makes me feel like my worth and value is based on being submissive to them and
Yeah.
a story that doesn't fit for me? And so there has to be a separation from that. And I feel like that's the part I'm just getting to with faith is
Mm-hmm.
separating faith and spirituality from religion. And so
Yeah.
again, the conversation with my daughter of like, I don't know anything. I do also, I guess maybe one more thing I am sure of is I'm not the most important thing in the world.
Yeah. Yeah.
I, as a human, am not the most important thing. I,
Yeah.
as Kyira, am not the most important thing in the world. I have worth and value. So does the rest of the world. And so just thinking about this idea, I'm just going to say then, because we're going to do a part 2, where should we leave it today? Because right now where I'm ripe with, I mean, I can feel it. I'm hot. I'm like, this is exciting. This is good. We're talking about acceptance as a form of basically suppression is the way we get acceptance versus liberation and finding this freedom and finding ourselves. And how do we trust we can find belonging?
Mm-hmm.
Where do we want to leave it for today? so that we can come back and we can kind of keep going next time.
As you're talking, I love this idea of there's a cliffhanger, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that is the true nature of courage, is we don't know what's on the
Ooh.
other side, right? When I hung up on that pastor, it was 20 years of a relationship that I was redefining.
Yes.
And there was no blueprint moving forward. Unfortunately for him, he decided that there was no way forward.
Mm-hmm.
And we, I was open to a new way forward
Mm-hmm.
that did not have me looking like a little kid and him as my parent, but was
Yeah.
more based on me as an adult and him as an adult, and us working together to do something. But I think that is the thing. On the other side, we don't know, and having the courage to do that thing that we know is in the back of our head
Mm.
is the most important thing. It's taking the step and not seeing the bridge, not
Mm.
seeing the stairway.
I love this. I think you're right. This is such an interesting spot that we got to end today, because we know you made the decision. You actually, like literally, but also metaphorically, hung up the phone. Like
Mhm.
you took the opportunity to say no, the decision to go from that to everything you've done, even
Mhm.
through this most recent shift and the finalization of your divorce, like all of these parts, that didn't happen overnight. And I think for many people, it's also realizing that when we go to those extremes, it's often a rush to just be fine and to be okay. And it's like, well, I'm just never going to do this again. But we're
Mhm.
typically just creating what we call avoidant goals of just, I
Mhm.
want to be anywhere but here. And then we
Mhm.
find ourselves in another completely similar dynamic, just with a different structure. And so
Yeah.
having to then, my guess is you've learned the peeling back of layers, which teaches us patience, teaches us that curiosity versus the research, and like just being open rather than having to find the answer and allowing
Mhm.
that iterative nature. And so, listeners, let's say for today, as you are wrapping up and as we think about part two, I want you to consider whether it's religion, it could be your work environment, a relationship that you've been in. We've talked about these systems of power and control and the pressure to perform to meet conditions and expectations to feel like you're enough. Just
Mhm.
ask yourself where you've done that, how you've been taught that that's what you're supposed to do, where you've been given this roadmap to something that maybe doesn't feel right. And we're not reflecting on this with judgment. We're reflecting on this with curiosity, because we've all done it. We have all done it. We have conformed and performed because we believe that's our only option. And so just consider where you have done this, or maybe how you're currently doing this. And then when we come back for part two, we're going to talk about what happens when you take that step and you feel like you're free falling. How do you navigate that? And how do you start to take steps forward? And then we're really going to get to know the magic of Carl, because we're going to talk about the work he does with companies and with individuals then that are going through that change process to help act as a catalyst to support you in that step and also in finding your footing when you land. Okay, Carl, this has been great. I'm not going to say anything else because we're going to talk for another hour. So we're going to save it all for part two. Listeners,
Love
we'll
it.
see you back here in a couple weeks. Let us know in the comments if there are things coming up that we can take into account for our next episode as we record it. And we'll see you back here soon.